My name is Mark Edele, and the book is called Stalinism at War, the Soviet Union in World War II. Well, I've been interested in the history of the Soviet Second World War for much of my academic career, and I felt it was time to bring together a few kind of strands of research which don't talk to each other. So there's a very well-established military history of the German-Soviet War, so what the Russians would call the Great Patriotic War, or the Germans call the Eastern Front. There is an increasing number of political histories of the leadership in the war. There are diplomatic histories of the wider context of war, both in Asia and in Europe, and how the Soviet Union was trying to find its way within that context. And there's a well-established economic history of this war. And then there's the newer literature, which is social and cultural history. And I felt it was time to bring them together. So that was the one attempt, or the one kind of inspiration, is to try to integrate or get them to talk to each other, these various literatures. The other aspect is that one of the big moments in my field, which used to be called Russian history, was that people realized that the Soviet Union was not just Russia, but that in 1991, the breakdown of the Soviet Union, of course, had a big impact on that. So what has happened is what could be maybe described as kind of like decolonization of Soviet history, that it's no longer just told as the history of Russia, but the history of Ukraine, of the Baltic states, of Central Asia. And for the war, that has also started to happen. But again, these debates became sort of parallel. So you have increasing history of Ukraine during the war, a history of several histories of Central Asia during the war. The Baltic countries write their own histories, and so on. And again, I felt that it might be a good moment to remind people that the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic society where half of the population were not Russian, and that this was not Russia's war. This was the Soviet Union's war. So these are the two kind of attempts at kind of integration I was trying to accomplish. Like many of my colleagues, I began as a Russianist. So I was trained as a historian of Russia, really. My original language competency is in Russian, which, of course, in the Soviet case, gets you pretty far, given that was the lingua franca under Stalin in particular. And so much of my early research was in Russian archives, which had opened up quite dramatically after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and which are still open. I mean, there are some archives which are less open now, particularly the military archive, although it's technically still open, but it's very hard to work as a foreigner in there. But then in the recent decade and a half, I guess, I started to go to Ukraine. I started to go to the Baltic countries and work in the archives there. And the research situation in these countries is fabulous. The KGB archives are fairly wide open. I mean, in Ukraine, the biggest problem with the SBU, so the KGB archive, is that it is located within the building of the actual security services of Ukraine. So the difficulty getting in has more to do with security clearance and getting a space in a very small reading room than exclusion. So that once you manage to get in there, the work there is extremely good. So I've worked in Ukrainian and in the Ukrainian security and party archives, as well as in the state archive, and in security archives in all three Baltic countries. So I've sort of moved from my kind of base in Russian history really into a broader at least European Soviet Union history. I think what's new is that the narrative really integrates a much wider variety of people. So if you're thinking about the way this war has often been written, as to cite one very good book, I think Ivan's War, right? I have Russians in there, but I have a lot of Jews, I have Ukrainians, I have people from Central Asia, I have Koreans. So I have displaced Germans who end up contributing to the war effort, and so my characters are, all Soviet, if you like, in a way, which changes the narrative quite dramatically. And in terms of the overall kind of the overall argument of what makes them win the war, in many ways, I very closely align myself with economic historians of this war, who basically argue that in the end it was economic superiority and the ability of the state to mobilize the population, independent of the extent of loyalty and disloyalty, which is a very complicated topic which I deal with in an entire chapter. So the real core question of what makes the Soviet Union win the war is economic, but what I also try to do is show the multiplicity of experiences of Soviet citizens or Soviet subjects, however you want to think about that. Obviously, I mean, if you write the history of the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s and the beginning 50s, Stalin is a major actor, right? So it is in one aspect a political history of the Soviet Union as well, and there, of course, Stalin is the major actor. I mean, there's no way around that. What happens during the war is kind of paradoxical in a way. On the one hand, you get with the beginning of the war with Germany. So I begin, just to backtrack here a little bit, I begin the Second World War much earlier than the attack on the Soviet Union. World War II for me begins with the start of fighting in China in 1937. And then the Soviet-Japanese border war of 38-39 is an integral part of World War II. And then the war in the West, the campaigns in Poland and Finland and the annexations of the Baltics, I also see as part of the Soviet participation in World War II. But in the moment of crisis in summer of 1941, when the Germans attack, what happens is that on the one hand, you get a further centralization of power. So Stalin becomes, as the head of the State Defense Committee, the head not only of the party apparatus, but also of the state apparatus, which before he technically wasn't. Now, in reality, he was. But technically, they created a new emergency committee which brought the two hierarchies of the Soviet governance, so the state and the party hierarchies together. So it seems that, and if you're reading kind of the files of Stalin as well as of the Defense Committee, there is, they run this war effort very, very centralized. But on the other hand, in fact, what happens is that a lot of the power, so the decision making gets further centralized, but the implementation is very decentralized. So in essence, it's troubleshooters are sent out to fix things. The regions behind the front line become more and more autonomous as long as they, deliver what they're meant to deliver in terms of production. They're left more or less alone. They make a lot of the decisions of how to allocate resources without help from the center anymore. So there's quite a decentralization of decision making. You see that in the army as well. That lower level officers get more autonomy in making immediate decisions about the fighting in their sector, right? So you have, on the one hand, what allows them to win this war, I think, is on the one hand this hyper centralization, but on the other hand, a fairly far-reaching decentralization of the actual implementation of these decisions, which are reached at the top, and so that transforms, I think, the Soviet state apparatus quite dramatically from what we have in the early part of the war, where Stalin, since the Great Terror, Stalin is very much, the nearly sole actor in this political system. During the war, his team, but also lower level officials, become much more important in actually running the show. So there's a kind of a dual system, which Stalin then tries to unmake after the war, but that's another story altogether again. I mean, this was the book I wanted to write for a very long time, and I kept being sidetracked. I wrote an entire short but much more kind of specialized monograph on defectors, and that was not so much that I was surprised that they existed, but that I found so much material on them in the German military archive. So these are people who not just get captured, but who actively cross the front line and give themselves up to the Germans. And that was a fairly widespread phenomenon, particularly early in the war. And so that was one thing that got me sort of on a tangent I hadn't planned. The other one is Polish Jews, which play quite a big role in my book. So people who become Soviet citizens, either because in 1939 they flee from the German occupied to the Soviet occupied part of Poland, because they migrate in the first place, because they get deported by Stalin as potential class enemies, and therefore survive the war because they get taken away from the Germans and the Holocaust. It turns out that the Melbourne Jewish community has a large contingent of people who are descendants of Polish Jews who survived the war in the Soviet Union, and their stories in many ways run against a lot of the cliches we're having about this war, and I found them a very kind of interesting group to follow up, and that led to a little side project of a book with Tina Grossman and Sheila Fitzpatrick, edited, and a whole group of scholars on basically the Soviet Union functioning as an inadvertent shelter from the Holocaust for Polish Jews, because the majority of Polish Jewry who survive in the Soviet Union. So that was another tangent I hadn't planned to pursue, but which sort of fascinated me on the way to this book. I like to tell the story of my wife is an American. I am originally a German, and we had this lockbox for our house key in our old house because we kept locking ourselves out of the house. And my wife locks herself out of the house, and she calls me and says, "I can't get the lockbox open. Have you changed it?" And I said, "No, it's beginning of World War II." And she says, "Well, I tried 1941. It didn't work." So for America, I said, "Well, it's 39, of course, right?" So for a European, the war begins in 39. For Americans, it usually begins with Pearl Harbor, right, in 41. For many people in Asia, it begins much earlier, and that's one of the things. My relocation to this part of the world has made me much more aware of Asia as a central part of world history than I was before. So for Japanese or Chinese historians, the war begins either at the beginning of the 30s or at the latest in 37. And if you're looking at, the land war in China, there is continuous fighting from 37 to 45, and then the fighting continues as the Chinese Civil War to 49. So it makes a lot of sense to say, from an Asian perspective, World War II is, 37, 45, and possibly beyond. And for the Soviet perspective, I mean, the Soviets are involved in this, and they're very worried about the Eastern Front, and they're very worried about a two-front war, right? So have to fight against either Poland or Germany in the east, in the west, and against Japan in the east. And so a lot of the international politics of the 30s are really trying to somehow find a way to balance this. And one strategy, which, or maybe it's more like a tactic, an opportunistic exploitation of the beginning war in Asia, is that Stalin throws quite a bit of money and also material support and also some advisors and pilots and so on behind the Chinese early in the war, with the hope that the Chinese will bog down Japan in China and therefore keep Japan from attacking the Soviet Union. And to make a very long story short, yes, there are two major battles in 38 and 39, but basically it works, that tactic, because most of the Japanese ground troops are, for much of the time until the war in the Pacific really heats up, China is where the Japanese ground forces are bogged down, and therefore the war, the original target, which is the Soviet Union, recedes more and more into the background. So I begin the Soviet involvement in World War II in 37, but in terms of fighting, 38, 39, and then immediately the fighting shifts to the west in the campaign against Poland, and then in 39, and then in 39-40 in Finland, and then, of course, we get the story which we're more familiar with, which is the summer of 41. Germans attack the Soviet Union, and then you have the catastrophe of the first phase of the war against Germany, and then the triumph from 43 onwards. And then, of course, they switch again and fight against Japan in the summer of 1945, help defeating Japan, and then the war continues as a guerrilla and counterinsurgency war, a very hard-fought and very often very dirty and bloody war in the Western borderlands, in particular in Western Ukraine and in the Baltic states. And I take the endpoint as 49, which is where the last really big deportation wave really takes away a lot of the local support for the Western anti-Soviet guerrillas, but in many ways, as a terrorist movement that continues into the 50s. So one could go beyond 49, but I take basically 49 as the endpoint of the actual war or the pacification in the Western borderlands. So there's a chapter on war preparation, which is basically kind of a short history of the 30s, if you like. And that chapter argues that basically, so a lot of what Stalin does in the early 30s, forced collectivization, force-based industrialization, terror against cadres from the old regime, the training of new cadres, and so on, is much of that is quite consciously a preparation for the coming war. So he thinks war is inevitable. He doesn't know exactly when it'll come, but that it will come is clear, and that the Soviet Union is unprepared for modern industrialized warfare is also clear to him. So a lot of the kind of the brutality of early Stalinism is very strongly motivated by war preparation. And in a way, in an extremely crude way, it works. I mean, they are much more prepared for war in 1937. But then the Great Terror begins, and the Great Terror is also, to a large extent, motivated by the same thoughts about preparing for war. The idea is that if war comes, you need to have a unified home front, and Stalin sees, not first a party, but then the closer his security services look everywhere in the Soviet Union, the more enemies they find, right? So he feels that the country is riddled by enemies and they need to be eliminated. So the Great Terror of 37 and 38 is very much motivated by that. But it does not have any of the even residual positive results the first Stalin revolution has, and in many ways it decreases the level of war preparation, and we can see that all over the place. I mean, you quoted the ravaging of the officer corps, which is a big problem. It also completely undermines morale in the army because nobody dares to train soldiers hard, because if they feel done hard by an officer, they will denounce him as an enemy of the people. And so a lot of the training becomes quite weak. They don't have a lot of initiative anymore. They're really fearful for making decisions, and all of that plays into the catastrophe of the first part of the war. In the industrial sphere, given that a lot of the more experienced managers and engineers and so on have been either put in a gulag or executed, you have a similar kind of decrease of the level of competency. In the cultural sphere, they had invested a lot into creating a whole pantheon of Russian national, but also Soviet heroes of the home front, heroes in the army, in order to unite the Russian part of the Soviets, about half the population, right, behind the regime. Now, the Great Terror, a lot of these people who have been celebrated disappear and get shot and so on, and be declared enemies of the people. So they have to begin from scratch again. So in terms of preparation for war, they are actually worse off in 39 than they were in 37. So the Great Terror is really the big destructive moment leading up to the war, and explaining a lot of the problems in the early phase of the Soviet-German war in particular. What we probably need is to simply bring together the variety of histories that have been written. That's in many ways, one of the goals of this book, is that what we have is a splintering of this history into a history of Ukraine in World War II, Russia in World War II, the Baltic states in World War II, Central Asia in World War II, which are all, these are all, worthwhile projects to pursue, particularly because these are now independent states who, of course, need to tell their own history. But if we want to understand what happened in World War II in Asia and in Europe, and the contribution or the role, the positive or negative role of the Soviet Union in the war, both in Europe and in Asia, we have to still write the history of the Soviet Union as well, right? So in a way, I'm somewhat trying to integrate the new histories of the non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union into a history of the Soviet Union, rather than just say, oh, we'll just ignore, the Soviet Union, and we'll just talk about the history of Ukraine in World War II, which again, I think is a worthwhile project from a Ukrainian perspective. But if we want to, the country that existed in during World War II was the Soviet Union, and so we need to understand what the role of that particular country was. I think one of the overarching points of the book is that the role of the Soviet Union was in the war, in World War II, in Europe, but also in Asia, was extremely important, and that we need to really bring together the history of Asia and the history of Europe in the Soviet case to understand the role the Soviets played in positive and in negative terms during World War II. And that's really what the book is one of the things the book is about, I think. So, I mean, in Russia, there's two main archives which are really difficult to work with, which would be really good to get into. One is the Presidential Archive, and that has a lot of the high-level politics stuff. Some Russian colleagues got some, limited access to it, very controlled access, but we don't know what's in there. So there might be all sorts of, on the kind of high policy level, there might be all sorts of interesting things to be found. I don't have a lot of hope at the moment that this will be thrown wide open. The Russians have been publishing an enormous amount of archival material sort of from the mid-levels. It's nearly as if they're swamping historians, and then they can say, well, you've not read all the documentation. How can you say anything about the Soviet Union in World War II? But on the other hand, the other archives that used to be actually technically open and has been basically closed again for Westerners or for non-Russians is the military archive in Padolsk outside of Moscow. And that, of course, would also be extremely interesting to see. So the kind of histories you can have for the German army in World War II, where you can write divisional histories. You just simply can't do that for the Soviet case because that archive is not available. Ukraine is pretty open. I don't think there's a lot hidden there. And I was quite impressed of how open the KGB archive is. I would have expected actually that there would have been some kind of management of files if they referred to the OUN UPA. I had no such experience that that material is available, and it's very often that what the Soviets report is very often very negative about OUN UPA, right? Because it was the NKVD reporting on them, right? So I don't have the impression that there's a lot being hidden away in that. The holdings are much smaller than what would be in the central archives of the Soviet Union in Moscow. So it's really Moscow, I think, which is the big unknown still. And some things have gone backwards. So some archives some holdings in archives which used to be open are now less so or not at all. And so, but there's still, one can still work in Russian archives at this stage.